The morning fog hung thick over the tree line in Normandy, France, August 17, 1944. It was just before sunrise, and every breath inside the Sherman tank felt louder than it should have. Sergeant Franklin Dawes, 25 years old, from Cleveland, Ohio, had been looking through a strange-looking device for the last 10 minutes. It was not regular military equipment. In fact, it looked more like something you would find in a kid's science fair project, a long, thin viewing device bolted at an odd angle into the turret hatch. His crew had laughed at it just yesterday. They called it Frank's upside-down periscope. But now in this moment nobody was laughing. Frank barely moved as he whispered into the intercom, "Hold steady. It's out there somewhere near the orchard line." His tank sat perfectly still, hidden in a ditch near a narrow forest path just outside the village of Says. The Americans believed a German Panther was moving through the area. It was one of the most feared tanks the German army had used in northern France. Inside the cramped metal belly of the Sherman, the air smelled of oil, sweat, and nervous silence. Corporal Joe Harrison, the driver, gripped the controls like they were lifelines. Sam Miller, the gunner, kept one hand on the elevation wheel, the other on the trigger. Ralph "Tiny" Gibson, the loader, cradled a 75mm high-explosive shell like it was a newborn baby. Then Frank saw it. A flicker, a shimmer, something metallic moving behind the hedgerow, barely visible through the reversed viewing parts of his homemade periscope. Not headlights, not soldiers. No, this was something else. Something bigger. He whispered again. "Target 3 o'clock. It's a Panther." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The Panther, officially named Panzer Kampfwagen 5, was faster, better armored, and had a main gun that could punch through a Sherman like a tin can from over 1,000 yards. Frank knew the odds. Everyone inside the tank knew the odds. But none of them moved. Because Frank's invention, the same one they'd mocked for days, had just given them the one thing every tank crew prayed for before a fight: the first shot. He leaned back from the scope, his voice steady. "Doc, take the shot when I give the word. Tiny, stay low. Joe, engine off." He paused, listened, counted the seconds between rustling leaves. Then, in a voice barely louder than the breath of the forest, he said, "Now." The oddball from Ohio. Before he was Sergeant Dawes, tank commander of 2nd Platoon, 72nd Armored Battalion, Franklin Eugene Dawes was just a skinny kid from the working-class streets of Cleveland, Ohio. Born in 1919, raised by a widowed mother and 2 older sisters, Frank spent more time with scrap metal and broken radios than with other kids his age. By 16, he could build a working carburetor out of lawnmower parts. By 18, he had wired a telescope to a rifle sight just to see what would happen. His high school principal once wrote on his record, "Imaginative, persistent, unusual, a bright mind, poorly suited for rules." When war came to America after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, Frank didn't hesitate. He enlisted the very next day, not because of love for his country, he admitted later, but because he was bored. "I figured if I was going to die someday," he once told a buddy, "I'd rather die moving forward than standing still." Basic training didn't love him, and the feeling was mutual. He questioned orders, changed equipment without permission, and once rigged his bunk to lift like a drawbridge to avoid nighttime inspections. But there was something about the way he thought, something sharp, unusual that made him stand out. The Army, unsure where else to put him, eventually sent him to tank school in Fort Knox, Kentucky. That's where he met his future crew. Joe Harrison, the reckless driver from Tulsa, Oklahoma, Sam "Doc" Miller, a gunner who used to teach physics, and Ralph "Tiny" Gibson, a 6'3", 250-pound loader who once wrestled a mule during a bar fight. They called themselves Ghost Baker, a nickname that started as a joke about their tendency to disappear from the radar during training exercises and somehow reappear exactly where they were needed. But Frank made sure they lived up to the name. Under his leadership, they didn't fight loud. They fought smart. By the time they landed in Normandy in late July of 1944, nearly 2 months after D-Day, Frank had already earned a reputation. Part mechanic, part mad scientist, and fully committed to keeping his crew alive. He had a rule: if it gives us an edge and doesn't explode in our faces, we try it. His crew didn't always understand his ideas, but they followed him. Until the day he introduced the upside-down periscope. Then they started to wonder if maybe Frank had finally lost it. Sherman versus Panther. To understand why Frank Dawes was so obsessed with finding Panther tanks before they found him, you need to understand what it meant to face one. On paper, it wasn't a fight. It was an execution. The American M4 Sherman, Frank's tank, was officially classified as a medium tank. Weighing around 33 tons, armed with a 75mm M3 gun, it was fast, reliable, and built like a Ford pickup truck. And that wasn't a coincidence. It was literally designed for mass production. By the end of the war, the United States had built over 49,000 Shermans. Quantity was the strategy. But in a one-on-one fight, the Sherman was painfully outmatched. The German Panther, the Panzer Kampfwagen 5, was technically also a medium tank. But that term meant something very different in German hands. The Panther weighed nearly 45 tons. It carried a 75mm KWK-42 long barrel gun that could shred a Sherman at more than 1,000 yards. Its front armor was sloped and thick up to 80mm, making it almost impossible to damage from the front. Its viewing equipment was sharper. Its gun had longer reach. It was a sniper rifle inside a tank's body. To Sherman crews like Frank's, the Panther wasn't just a tank. It was a predator. American instructions reflected this brutal reality. Shermans were told to flank Panthers, outnumber them, or avoid them entirely, unless artillery or air support was available. Taking one head-on? That was suicide. Frank knew this. Everyone in Ghostbaker knew this. They had seen the burned-out husks of other Shermans on the sides of hedgerows, still smoking. Hatches blown off. Turrets peeled open like tin cans. In tank-to-tank combat, Panthers were reapers, silent, sudden, and savage. But the Panther wasn't perfect. It was heavy, almost too heavy. Its complex suspension system and transmission often broke down in rough terrain, especially in the forests and hills of Normandy. It struggled. Its turret rotated slower. Its supply lines were thinner, and most importantly, there just weren't enough of them. The Germans built fewer than 6,000 Panthers during the entire war. It was a beast, yes, but a rare one. That was the weakness Frank focused on. You can't outgun a Panther, he once told his crew. But if you outthink it just once, you don't have to fire a second shot. So while other tank commanders relied on speed or brute force, Frank built his odds differently. He built them on anticipation, on geometry, on field changes that others laughed at, like sandbags for armor, engine mufflers for stealth, and yes, an upside-down periscope. Because in a war where seconds could save your life, seeing first was everything. Frank's crazy idea, the upside-down periscope. The idea came to Frank in the quiet hours between orders, those strange, restless moments when the fighting stopped. But the fear didn't. They were parked near an old barn outside of Le Bocage, France, repairing a throne track for the third time that week. The sun was setting, casting long orange shadows across the countryside. That's when Frank saw it. A broken German field scope half buried in the dirt near the tree line, likely left behind in the chaos of retreat. It was cracked, but the viewing part still worked. He turned it over in his hands, examining the internal angles. The idea sparked like a firecracker in his mind. What if he mounted the lens backward? Back at camp, using leftover brackets, rubber tubing from a busted fuel line, and part of a downed German Air Force radio antenna, Frank began piecing together something no Sherman had ever used before. A field-made reverse-mounted periscope. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't stable. But it gave him something no manual, no officer and no regulation could provide, a new angle on the battlefield. But not everyone was impressed. When Frank first showed the device to his crew, Joe burst out laughing. "You're going to get us killed with that thing," he said. Tiny muttered something about tinfoil hats. And Doc, ever the scientist, asked flatly, "Frank, why not just stick your head out like a normal person?" Frank didn't answer. He simply said, "Because sticking your head out gets you killed." And he wasn't wrong. In the bocage country of Normandy, where thick hedgerows turned every road into a death trap, German snipers and anti-tank teams watched for movement above the turret. One moment of exposure, just a glimpse of a helmet, could mean instant death. Frank had seen it happen, but no one higher up seemed interested in his solution. When he requested permission to formally install the periscope, his commanding officer reportedly shook his head and said, "This isn't a science fair, Dawes. Stick to the manual." Frank did not. Over the next few days, he quietly strengthened the device using bolts from a wrecked Jeep and added a rubber gasket to stabilize the view. He adjusted the mirror angle to match the pitch of the turret and designed a pivot that allowed him to scan without moving the tank. It wasn't perfect. The image was inverted and it gave him headaches if he stared too long, but it worked. And more importantly, it kept him alive. The idea may have been crazy, but it was born from cold, simple math. In tank warfare, the first to see usually shoots first, and the first to shoot, more often than not, walks away. Still, the mockery didn't stop. One crew from another platoon called it Frank's fancy toilet paper roll. Another accused him of wasting time when they should be checking fuel lines. Even his own men, though loyal, weren't sure if the device would ever matter in a real fight. But Frank believed in it. Not because it was elegant, not because it was approved, but because if it gave his crew even 5 seconds of advantage, it might mean the difference between going home in a Sherman or coming back in a box. Intelligence reports in the night of the ambush. By mid-August of 1944, the hedge hell of Normandy was thinning. The Americans were pushing east. The Germans were falling back. But nothing was certain. Every town they captured came at a cost. Every forest they entered could be their last. And it was in one such forest near the outskirts of Sais that Frank's unusual invention would meet its moment. The day started like most. Engine checks, fuel top-offs, half-warm rations, and the steady hum of dread. Around noon, a messenger from battalion headquarters arrived with new information. The message was short but chilling. German armor, likely Panther class, spotted near Route Départementale 225. Estimated 2 vehicles eastbound, heavily camouflaged, potential counteroffensive. The coordinates put them less than 3 miles from Ghost Baker's position. That night, under a pale half-moon and the dull drone of distant artillery, Frank's platoon was ordered to take up a screening position near a wooded junction north of town. Their job was to prevent any enemy armor from slipping south and disrupting a key American supply convoy. It was supposed to be routine. It never was. Frank chose the position himself. A narrow trail that cut through dense forest and led to a small clearing bordered by an abandoned orchard. The trees created natural cover. The trail created a choke point. And the orchard? That gave him a perfect line of sight. He parked Ghost Baker in a shallow depression nestled between 2 hedgerows. They shut down the engine, switched to whisper mode, checked the gun again and again. No campfire, no lights, no talking. For 5 hours they waited in silence. And it was in that silence that something strange happened. The kind of moment you only get when war presses in from all sides. The jokes stopped. The doubts quieted. Even the nickname toilet paper roll was forgotten. Everyone in the tank, consciously or not, began to look at the strange device mounted inside their turret. Not with laughter, but with hope. Frank used it like a violinist tuning an instrument. Slow movements, gentle shifts, scanning back and forth along the tree line. Every 30 seconds he paused to readjust the viewing parts. Every 10 minutes he rubbed the lens with the corner of his sleeve. His crew didn't speak, but they watched him. And somehow, in that soft red interior light, the device no longer looked ridiculous. It looked necessary. At approximately 400 hours, 4 in the morning, Frank froze. His breath caught. A sliver of motion just beyond the orchard. Not the blur of infantry, not the lurch of a supply truck. This was different. Low, deliberate, methodical. Through the inverted lens of his periscope, he saw it. The faint glint of a German tank's observation scope moving between trees. A Panther, less than 200 meters away, creeping through the woods with its turret sweeping side to side. Frank whispered, "Panther, 2 o'clock. Hold position." In most tanks, this is where panic begins. Someone yells, someone overreacts, someone opens the hatch too soon. But not in Ghost Baker. They had drilled this. Frank had prepared them for this very moment. Joe killed the ignition. Sam rotated the gun slow and smooth. Tiny loaded a high-velocity armor-piercing round and locked it in. Frank kept eyes on the target. The Panther moved to the edge of the trail. It hadn't seen them, not yet. It was turning, exposing its side armor. One more step and it would vanish behind another row of trees. Frank had seconds to decide. If they fired and missed, the Panther would return fire. And at that range, the Sherman's armor might as well be paper. But if they waited too long, the opportunity would pass. Frank's voice cut through the silence. "Doc, target in line, fire!" The Sherman roared. The 75mm shell screamed across the clearing and struck the Panther mid-hull. A flash, a cloud of smoke. Then silence. No explosion. No return fire. Frank shouted, "Reload!" Tiny slammed in the next round. Sam fired again. This time the shot hit the turret ring. The Panther lurched. Flames erupted through the top hatch. Its engine screamed, then choked. Within 30 seconds it was still. The battlefield fell silent, the kind of silence that feels like it's holding its breath. No engine rumble, no footfalls, just the slow, settling groan of cooling metal, and the distant crackle of something burning. Inside the Sherman, no one spoke. Not because they were calm, but because their bodies hadn't caught up to what their minds were realizing. They had killed it. They had killed a Panther. Frank blinked several times, his eyes still locked on the wreckage through the clouded lens of his makeshift scope. The smoke drifted sideways with the morning breeze, revealing the shape of the German tank more clearly now. It sat awkwardly like a beast caught mid-stride, frozen by death. The right tread had been blown clean off, half the turret blackened by fire. One hatch hung open, swinging slightly as if the crew inside had tried to escape and failed. Sam was the first to speak. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "We actually did it." Frank didn't answer. He just stared. Not with pride, not yet. With something heavier. He'd seen Panthers before. He'd seen them crush friendly tanks with 2 or 3 well-placed shots. He'd seen what was left after they were done. Burnt-out holes, scorched bodies, turrets turned inside out. But this was the first time he'd seen one brought down by his own hands. Ralph "Tiny" Gibson took off his helmet and ran a trembling hand through his hair. He was usually the joker, the one with a one-liner ready for any occasion. But right now even he couldn't speak. Joe, the driver, reached forward and gently touched the dashboard as if it had kept them alive out of sheer loyalty. Frank finally turned his head away from the periscope. "Reload," he said quietly. "Sir?" Tiny asked. "We only saw one. Doesn't mean there's not more." Tiny nodded wordlessly and began reloading another armor-piercing shell. Minutes passed, then 10, then 20, but nothing came. Just the light growing stronger, the smoke thinning, and the outline of their kill becoming more defined. And it was in those minutes that the crew began to process what had happened, not just as soldiers, but as men. The Panther wasn't just a tank. It was a symbol, a myth, a death sentence that rolled on tracks and wore a black cross on its side. To take one down was more than a tactical victory. It was personal. It was proof that the stories could be wrong. That maybe, just maybe, the guy with the weird invention, the guy everyone laughed at, maybe he saw something the rest of them didn't. Frank didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply opened the top hatch slowly and cautiously, then climbed halfway out into the morning light. What he saw hit him like a punch to the chest. The Panther wasn't alone. About 40 yards behind it, half hidden under netting and tree branches, was a second tank. Another Panther, unmoving, abandoned. Its crew must have bailed when the first was hit. Maybe they thought it was an ambush. Maybe they didn't want to die in a tin can like the others. Either way, they were gone. Frank climbed down and gestured to the rest of the crew. One by one they stepped out, taking in the scene with a mix of awe and disbelief. The main gun of the first Panther was still pointed in their direction, a silent threat that would never be carried out. Joe knelt next to the wreck, looked up at the others, and said, "I can't believe this was real." Sam ran his hand along the side of the Sherman. "You know what saved us?" he asked. They all knew the answer. Frank's Periscope. The thing that had been mocked, dismissed, written off as another one of his quirks. That absurd-looking device had seen the Panther before the Panther saw them. Had let them aim first. Fire first, live. Frank didn't say, "I told you so," he didn't have to. Instead, he just muttered, mostly to himself, "Seeing first wins wars." Later that day, a recon unit from battalion headquarters arrived to check the area. When they saw the Panther, still smoldering, and the Sherman that had done it, they asked the same question everyone else would later ask. How? The crew didn't explain it, not fully. They just shrugged and said, "We got lucky." But inside Ghostbaker, they knew luck had nothing to do with it. It was geometry, preparation, nerves, and a guy who refused to listen when people told him his idea was stupid. It wasn't the tank that beat the Panther. It was the man who refused to stop thinking. The legend of Ghostbaker. By the time the sun fully broke through the tree canopy, the word had already spread. A Sherman had taken down a Panther alone. No artillery, no air support, no lucky flank. Just 5 men, 1 shot, and something no one had seen before. Ghostbaker wasn't just a call sign anymore. It was a story. The recovery team that arrived that afternoon took photos. not just of the Panther wreckage, but of the Sherman that had done the job. Scorch marks still clung to its bow. Mud was caked across its treads. But the crew? They stood straight for the photo, dirt on their faces, helmets tilted back, expressions unreadable. Later, in a makeshift briefing tent a few miles behind the front, the battalion commander asked Frank to explain how they'd pulled it off. Frank didn't give a lecture. He didn't draw a diagram. He just pulled the periscope from his tank, set it on the folding table, and said, "This." The room went quiet. One officer leaned in and muttered, "That's homemade." Frank nodded. The commander stared at the device. Mismatched metal, burn marks along the side, lenses slightly warped from vibration. It looked more like a plumbing accident than military hardware. But it had worked, and no one could argue with results. No official award followed, not immediately. The Army wasn't always quick to reward creativity that broke the rules. But in the barracks, around campfires, in the nervous laughter between shellings, Frank's name started to float around. Some called him the Mad Mechanic. Others went with Doc Frankenstein. But to most, especially within his platoon, he was simply the guy who saw first. And slowly the tone changed. It wasn't mockery anymore. It was respect. Crews from other Shermans came by to ask questions. Could he build another? What materials had he used? Was it hard to install? Frank showed them what he could, warned them about the headaches from the inverted image, and even offered to help if time allowed. One young lieutenant, barely 20, said to him, "I used to think all that tinkering was a waste of time. Now I think you're going to outlive us all." Frank didn't laugh. He just looked down at his hands, grease-stained, blistered, trembling slightly, and replied, "I'm not trying to live forever. I'm just trying to see tomorrow." Back inside Ghost Baker, the atmosphere had changed too. Where once there had been teasing, now there was trust. Tiny started calling the Periscope Old Reliable. Doc began drawing up plans to improve the field of view. Joe, who once joked about being buried in that coffin on treads, now checked the optics before checking the engine. The moment they had all seen as a fluke had instead become a turning point, not just in reputation but in mentality. They were no longer prey. They were hunting for the next one. That shift, that quiet mental realignment, was something that couldn't be taught in manuals. It came only from experience, from surviving the impossible, from watching the unthinkable happen and realizing that sometimes the crazy guy might be the only sane one in the room. The legend of Ghost Baker grew in the days that followed. Other units joked about installing a Frank scope. One platoon even painted a periscope symbol on the side of their tank in tribute. Frank never asked for any of it. He didn't want attention, but the story traveled. Because in a war defined by mass production, standard issue, and assembly line combat, a single handmade invention had changed the course of one deadly morning. And everyone knew that kind of story doesn't stay secret for long. The war didn't end that day in the forest. It kept going mile after mile, town after town, until the Allies pushed through France, crossed the Rhine, and brought Nazi Germany to its knees in May of 1945. But for Frank Dawes and the crew of Ghost Baker, something did end in that orchard clearing near Say. The fear, they still faced danger every day. They still lost friends. But after that morning, they carried something different into battle. Proof. Proof that they could survive. Proof that the impossible wasn't always. Proof that ideas, even strange ones, could be weapons. Frank survived the war. So did Joe, Sam, and Tiny. They went home in one piece, though none of them ever felt whole again. Frank never sought medals, never wrote a book. He didn't speak at reunions or sit for interviews. He worked as a mechanic, lived a quiet life, and kept the periscope in a dusty box in his garage. For years, he didn't talk about the war. Not to his family, not to neighbors, not even to the other men who'd been inside that Sherman with him. But decades later, when his grandson, a teenager curious about history, asked him what it felt like to go toe-to-toe with a Panther and win, Frank finally gave him an answer. He didn't talk about the tactics. He didn't talk about the kill. He just said, "It's not about killing the monster. It's about not letting the monster make you stop thinking." That's the legacy he left behind. In a war that demanded obedience, Frank chose ingenuity. In a machine designed to follow orders, he introduced invention. And in a world that often praises strength over subtlety, he proved that sometimes the smallest adjustment, the simplest idea, can save 5 lives and echo across generations. The upside-down periscope wasn't revolutionary in design. It didn't change the course of World War II. It didn't win a campaign, but it changed 5 men's fate on a cold morning in Normandy. It turned laughter into respect, doubt into action, and fear into resolve. The lesson isn't just military. It's human. Trust your instincts. Chase your ideas even when they laugh, especially when they laugh. Because progress doesn't always look like a blueprint. Sometimes it looks like a busted scope. Some bolts from a jeep and a soldier who refused to stop building, even with death staring straight at him. There's something quietly heroic about a man who doesn't wait for permission to do what he knows is right. Frank Dawes wasn't a general. He wasn't a war hero in the way we usually define them. He didn't lead a charge, plant a flag, or deliver an inspirational speech with orchestra music behind him. He was just one man in a steel box in the middle of a forest trying not to die. But maybe that's exactly where real courage lives. Not in grand gestures, but in the small decisions no one sees. The decision to tinker with a busted scope when everyone else is sleeping. The decision to believe in an idea no one else understands. The decision to trust your gut, even when your own crew rolls their eyes. Frank's story reminds us that innovation doesn't always come from engineers or think tanks. Sometimes it comes from a guy with grease under his fingernails and too much time between battles. Sometimes it comes from necessity, from fear, from desperation, from the burning need to stay alive one more day. But deeper than that, this story reminds us of something even more important. That every advance in survival, every edge we gain, doesn't start with strength. It starts with sight. Not just what we see with our eyes, but how we see. The battlefield isn't just out there. It's inside us, between what we're told and what we believe, between rules and instincts, between what's expected and what's possible. Frank didn't save his crew because he had better weapons. He saved them because he saw first and because he dared to trust what he saw, even when no one else did. In the end, the Panther wasn't just a tank. It was a test. And the Periscope wasn't just a tool. It was a statement. That thinking differently is not a flaw. It's survival. So maybe the next time someone scoffs at your idea, shrugs off your strange invention, or tells you to stick to the manual, you'll remember Frank Dawes crouched in the belly of a Sherman, staring through an upside-down scope, seeing a nightmare before it saw him. And maybe, just maybe, you'll build it anyway. What shocked you most? The Panther, the Periscope, or the fact that one man's wild idea actually worked? Let us know in the comments below.